Hello, everyone. This is Nicholas Capman. Welcome to the Passionate Workforce podcast. I am the author of The Passionate Workforce, How to Create and Maintain Maximum Employee Engagement, a #1 bestseller. So if you haven't picked up your copy yet, please do. Today, I am speaking with Liz Troll. Hey, Liz, how are you?
Hi everyone, I'm good today. How is everybody else?
Okay, fantastic. So, before we jump into the topic for today, would you kindly introduce yourself?
Sure, I'm Elizabeth Troll. Most people know me by Liz, and I am a 40 plus year veteran of the pharmaceutical development workplace. And all of that time has been spent in quality the discipline, whether it's quality control, quality assurance, or quality management. I'm really fascinated by the discipline that that creates and the consistency that that creates. And I'm very excited to be here talking about one of my more passionate topics, which is feedback. Because when you really think about it, those of us who are professional quality folks, we're really professional feedback givers. And the way we give it and the way it's received definitely impacts its ability to make change.
Well, that's great because I know a lot of people listening to this have struggled with that specific topic of feedback because they know they want to give it, they know it's useful, they don't know how to approach it. They're concerned that maybe they're going to shoot themselves in the foot. And so, I think this is definitely one of those, it's easier said than done type of aspects of the business world. So the kind of the exploratory statement, problem statement is feedback a guiding light or an anchor for optimal performance? So before we jump into feedback itself, you say guiding light or an anchor for optimal performance. Can you define what those two terms mean?
Sure, and I think it's fascinating that you actually have a picture of a lighthouse above your head because my personal talisman is either a lighthouse or a compass rose.
Hmm.
Because a lighthouse provides two things generally. It either provides a warning that there may be danger ahead as you enter, or it provides a direction for you to follow to land in a safe, quote unquote, safe place.
Hmm.
And so, as a guiding light, I believe that feedback helps you bridge the gap between the expectations that are of you or your role, the performance that's being experienced, and where is the gap in between. Because when those two things are aligned, when performance and expectations are aligned, kind of like train tracks, generally everyone's getting things done in the manner they want to get them done. And, in your book, you talk about a passionate workforce. And I think that taps into your passion because if you're aligned and doing something you're very passionate about and you know you're on track, so to speak, you can really give your all and really bring the best of you to either your work experience or your personal life experience.
Hmm. So I
So that's
really, I,
guiding light.
yeah, I really like. And I know we have to talk about anchor performance, but before we do that, the one thing that you said that I think just helps me and the audience listening is, um, and I'm sure there's more than just this, but in a very simple way, feedback is closing the gap between expectations and performance. So
Yep.
if I'm providing feedback, that's really in a very simplistic way what I'm trying to do is the performance isn't where the expectation is. However, sometimes feedback is positive. So then is that I guess it can go either way. So your feedback is your performance is actually beyond what my expectation is, or it's below what my expectation is, or it's right in line with what my expectation is. Okay,
Exactly.
right.
And then
Uh,
that gives an opportunity to have the conversation about, do you need to change the expectations?
right.
Right.
Okay.
And when you
Yeah,
think
because
about
it's a dialogue.
right, and when you think about performance management, if people want to continue to enhance their performance, because this is the time of the year, right, that people are usually getting that feedback in the workplace, is if you know you have different expectations moving forward and you can achieve them, you have confidence, then it becomes a very positive experience. It's always a growth opportunity as opposed to feeling like a conflict or feeling heavy on you.
Mm, okay. All right. Please expand on the anchor of optimal performance.
All right. So an anchor, again, an anchor has a purpose, right? So if again you use the lighthouse and you're coming into a safe haven, a safe cove, the anchor keeps you there. Well, the anchor can also then become complacency or stagnancy or just, you're not moving left or right or up or down or back or forth. And, I think there are natural places in your career path or your life path where you have lots of choices and then you choose to not do anything because it's either too overwhelming or it's too scary. And so sometimes when people are giving feedback, I would say, especially for me as a line manager, and I know someone's not really owning their outcome, they're capable, they're competent, but they're meeting expectations, but is that really enough? And that's a hard conversation to have, right?
Mm,
Is that, you know, the person's doing what they want to do, what they feel is the most important thing to do, but they may be dissatisfied because they weren't chosen for a promotion or they weren't assigned to a special project. But if the project or the promotion requires more than they're doing and they're choosing not to do more, logic tells you already there's a disconnect.
mm.
And so that's what I mean by an anchor.
Yeah, and I have to be open and honest with what just popped in my head when you said, are they meeting expectations? And if so, is that enough? That brings me right back to the movie Office Space, where Jennifer Aniston's character doesn't have enough flair.
Right.
And she says, "Well, you said it's 15 pieces that, right? And I have 15." And he's like, so there's that whole, well, am I meeting the expectation? Am I not meeting the expectation? Yeah. So if and maybe this would be my argument is if they're meeting the expectation and it's not enough, then you need to move your expectation.
Exactly. And that's where these conversations tend to get a little rough water. Let's continue to use the water analogy. Is if you as the person receiving feedback feel enough is enough, and you should be rewarded all the time for enough is enough. We all know that's not realistic because things are changing around you constantly.
Mm,
What was enough 6 years ago in your career might not be enough now.
mm,
Or if enough is enough, then your personal expectations should be tempered with how are you going to get, could you be a candidate for a special project? If that special project is a new technology or something that requires critical thinking skills or diagnostic activities that you're capable of doing, but you don't want to do them.
mm.
So me as a line manager, if I have this, kind of amorphous project that is very think tank like, would I put somebody in that role that will produce the same thing all the time? Does that fit the expectation of that project? Versus would I take that person who's doing the same things all the time with consistency and high performance if I had a inventory management problem where that should be routine, right? It's math, it's algebra. You say you have 100, but you go to the warehouse, you only have 98. Something's happened. I need someone to go figure that out. That person would probably be the best candidate because they're always going to look for the 100. If they expect 100, they're always going to look for 100. So also knowing the capabilities, the desires of the person and how they want to grow or perform becomes the counterbalance to the conversation.
Well, and it's funny. There must be some sort of telepathy going on here, because that's exactly what I was thinking. Is when we think about expectations and feedback, it's usually from our side, right, as the giver of that feedback.
Correct.
But because this is a dialogue, and we know that the person that we're speaking to, if we're, being a prudent leader and manager, we understand we've talked to them about what are your growth plans, if any. Are we talking about raises, changes in job titles? Are we talking about changes in function, and so on and so forth? And a lot of times, in order for them to achieve whatever that goal is, there's got to be a bar that they have to hurdle in order to qualify them for that. Um, Now there's that aspect. There's also another aspect, which is sometimes what they want just isn't available.
Absolutely.
And then if but maybe it was available. No, it's not available. Things have changed. We live in a dynamic world. That's going to be probably uncovered or at least discussed within this feedback conversation. And just to make things even more difficult for you, when you talked about the 98 units versus 100, I'm sure everybody struggles with this, is how often, how much do I say you were too short, here were the circumstances, it's understandable, versus you missed it, that's not acceptable. And then how do you move that conversation forward? So that's a whole bunch of stuff. So feel free to attack it however you see fit.
Okay. Okay, well, but to your point of, you may want something that had previously been available and isn't. I had that exact scenario in a line management conversation where there was a role that had been active for a couple of years. Previous leadership had chosen not to refill that role, but somebody was trying to train themselves to perform in that role. And the decision was to outsource that because the role was so broad it was really impossible to find one person that could cover all the aspects. So it was more proficient to find a series of, SMEs, subject matter experts to perform that on demand rather than it be a full-time role. And I needed to have that conversation with the person who wanted that role 3 times, 3 specific times to make them understand that the job I have as a line manager is to get the work done. And I have to do it at the most proficient level possible. So if outsourcing, because it's a unique opportunity that requires multiple skill sets, and that we will not find in one person, that actually has nothing to do with your desire for that role. If you want that role, we just don't have it. You'll have to look for it somewhere else. And, that was initially received as a hard piece of conversation. And, we had to have it a couple of times in order for the person to realize that you have to put the needs of the business first. And then again, like the train tracks, sometimes one track will veer to the left or one track will veer to the right. So if the distance gets too wide, then you have to choose what you want to do.
Mm,
And to give the person a ton of credit, they looked at why do they want that role. So they decided why they wanted that role, and they found a different role in a different department that had those same skills,
mm,
and then applied for that and was hired into that role and did an even better job than they did in the role they were in.
mm,
They became almost a superstar in that role because they were able to figure out what were the elements of the role that I wanted, not the title, but
mm.
what were the tactical aspects, what were the influence aspects, what were the technical aspects of that role. And once we could have that conversation to say, okay, what are you really looking for?
Mm.
And is the old role that doesn't exist anymore, is that the best choice for you?
Yeah. And one thing I wanted to think about is when we have an employee that comes into the organization and they're not meeting expectations, there used to be a binary choice, which is did you hire them that way or did you train them that way?
Right.
I'm going to insert a third, which is maybe you didn't hire them that way, and maybe they didn't get trained that way, but maybe they've evolved that way because we're not static, we're dynamic, and things change. Life changes. The start of a family can have a huge impact on what I had wanted versus what I currently want, right?
Yeah.
And so I think feedback, especially in a very respectfully candid, radically candid way, is very good. And I think a lot of times leaders and managers are afraid of that because they're under the belief, to a degree, it makes sense that retention is a positive thing, right? And retention is a positive thing because the opposite of that is just what we call it, the spinning
Rotate.
door, right? The
Yeah.
rotating door. And that we've seen those environments are not good, right? But at the same time, if we're being open and honest, we're being candid, people aren't static. Their desires and their life goals are changing. Sometimes uh, retention isn't always the best thing.
I
Maybe that person was, hitting it, just for use of numbers, 95, and they kind of went down to 90. Okay. And that's fine. It's good. You try to coach them back up. They're not really getting there. For whatever reason. And you're starting to have these really clear conversations about expectation versus performance and what are their goals moving forward. Um, and I'm picturing, a dirty closet, right? There's the dirty closet where as soon as you open it, everything falls out, right? That's a
Right.
very black and white,
Yeah.
that thing's out of control. We got to clean it up, right? But then there's the closet where, the vacuum's just kind of falling over, or there's that screw in the corner, right? That you see every week and you're too lazy to bend down and pick it up, right? So in some cases, I think this feedback can lead you into, and I guess I'm a man of a million analogies. Now I'm thinking about when Luke went into the cave, right? And but he had to go into the cave
Right.
in order to, kind of face his demon, and then the mask gets removed and it's his face and all that kind of stuff. And I guess the point I'm trying to make is don't always look at feedback as the only two wins are improved performance, um, well, I guess it's one and the same, improved performance and retention, right? Sometimes, and it also doesn't necessarily mean that if the person, I mean, obviously, if they're not performing and you need to replace them, that's a black and white issue. But what about the person that is, meeting expectations? They only got 15 pieces of flair,
Right.
right?
Right.
Um, but let's have a conversation about is this really what you want? If not, let's facilitate something so that you can get into a place where you can be passionate. Uh, Ding ding, right? And you can be passionate about your job and experience what your work life would be at an optimal performance. And then you could bring in somebody else that, hey, if that person's happy moving on, and I was able to facilitate that, and now I'm bringing somebody in that now is not at 90 but 95, the success are in the margins, and all of those little increments add up.
Absolutely.
And so I think within the feedback conversation, I don't think we need to always be attached to, I want to help this person improve and not lose them. Uh,
I completely agree. And I think those middle conversations are the hardest ones to have because
the gray area.
it has to have a level of vulnerability to have those
Yeah.
conversations on both sides of the equation, right? And so, what I channel, especially when I'm going to go into a conversation like that, is I'm a fan of the Stephen Covey 7 Habits of Highly Effective People, and I choose to channel habit number 5: first seek to understand, then be understood. And, I was taught an incredibly valuable lesson by a previous line manager where there was the hierarchy was a vice president, a senior director, and then 11 of us in manager and director roles. And the other 10 folks all had a subject matter expert area, but I oversaw all the other 10. So one year we had this huge group of goals and objectives to meet, and um, all the other 10 met theirs, but I didn't meet mine because I was busy helping the other 10. And in my performance review, my manager said to me, well, how do you think you did? And I said, well, I helped all these other people and blah, blah, blah. And the person said to me, well, how did you do with yours? Well, I got 2 out of the 3. Really wish I could have gotten the third. And he said, well, did you understand the impact of what the goals we assigned you were. And this was a year where we had to assign goals. You didn't get a choice. You had certain things you had to do. And I said, well, 1 and 2 were this. I said, I never really understood number 3. And he said, well, and that's why you're not going to get a bonus this year because number 3 was so significant to the future of our business. Missing it causes stockholder impact. Now, I didn't understand that. Shame on me, right? All the others were kind of raise the boats, raise the level, but they had given me a game changer that I didn't fully understand.
Well, shame on them for not showing you how important that was.
Well, we had that conversation as well, right? I had that conversation with the line manager, and I said, well, that should have been part of your responsibility because I don't necessarily have access to all that info. They took responsibility for that because in turn they got a ding as well because, if I didn't deliver, they didn't deliver, right? But that
Exactly.
was the most powerful conversation I've ever had because it showed me that you have to really understand what you're asking people to do. And in turn, you have to get an acknowledgement from them that they understand the ask. So if you start there, then performance and expectation, then the train tracks are narrower, right? But my train tracks were like this with that particular goal, and never forgotten that. And that was in the early '90s, really impactful.
Hmm.
And and then
So
the other,
it wasn't last year?
it was not last year. Not no, last year was a way exceeding expectations
Yeah.
scenario. But and you have those ebbs and flows in your career, but really understanding what you've been asked to do, and
Hmm.
then wholeheartedly taking that on. And
Hmm.
if you can't or won't or just don't, having the courage to have that conversation with your line manager is
Hmm.
just as important
Yeah.
because two-way street.
Right.
So
And when we talk about how closely was their behavior to the expectations, just the word expectations is a whole
yeah,
nother topic, right? So how many times for those that have kids have said, go clean your room, you leave, you come back, and then you
yeah,
say, I thought I told you to clean your room, and they go, I did.
yeah,
Right. Okay.
exactly,
So we have to define what does clean your room mean? Clean your room means, you know, what is and is not on the floor, what
right,
drawers are closed, what's on the desk, what's on the
right,
bureau,
right.
is the bed made? So what is done? How is it done? How well? What is the timing? Right? So, we have to make sure that when we're delivering expectations, it's smart. Is it specific, measurable, attainable, timely, and relevant? Right?
Exactly. Exactly. So when those are well established, then you have and again, I learned that lesson very early in my managerial career from that example.
Hmm. So, one of the things that, we kind of discussed bringing into this conversation before we started recording is the invitation to those people to be willing to accept feedback. And I can speak to that, but I'm not the guest. So please go for
Well,
that.
I'll speak a little, and then I would love to hear your point of view. So a lot of these things can be forced, right? Annual performance reviews, those kinds of things. They're an event. They're not necessarily invited. They're sort of voluntold that it's going to happen. So I think you have everything from the range of a casual impact to a very formal process that can feel relatively intimidating, right? So being open to any and all of those things is partially a characteristic of your personality and your level of comfort. Um, but it's also, I think, the responsibility, 51%, of the person giving the feedback. And so the other thing, again, so if I'm first seek to understand, then be understood, my first thought is, what is it going to feel like when I have something to say? How is it going to feel to the person? And so the other thing I learned, same line manager, is understanding the difference between delivering something that feels like critique or feels like criticism. And so if I
What is
define
the difference between those
it,
two?
so critique to me is I am going to explain the gap. Performance expectation. We are going to discuss
So
what
it's
the
not on the person, it's on the action.
on the action.
Okay.
Criticism is a value.
Oh, okay.
And if the people in the conversation don't share the same value structure, it's very easy for one or both to become incredibly defensive from the beginning.
Hmm.
So if you start the conversation with, you disappointed me because you didn't do X, that's going to feel like criticism, right? In my example that I gave you, it was a great opener. How do you feel? Well, I feel great because I helped these other 10 people. Okay, well, how do you feel about what were your responsibilities? Well, I got two-thirds done. I didn't do the other. We're having a wholly factual conversation. Then when the question came, well, did you understand the impact of the third to the future of the business? And my answer was no. Now I don't get to necessarily be defensive because I've acknowledged I didn't understand.
Hmm. Yeah.
And so as you navigate that way, it becomes more productive.
Yeah. And it's interesting how many synergies and parallels there are between dealing with an employee and dealing with a child, right? Because I'm not telling my child, you're stupid, you're a jerk, you're whatever. It is focusing very much on that action and behavior, So, when you tell your mom to go F herself, this is how, and obviously that's an extreme
Yeah.
example, right? But let's use a more reasonable example. So when I'll give you one. Okay. So in my house, we have three rules. We have three core values. No lying, no disrespect, communicate to be understood. If other than that, you don't have to worry about anything. Now, here's the secret, and everybody, you can mail the checks to my office. I can take anything as disrespect, right? So we actually have a whole bunch of rules, but to them we only have like two to three. So I would say, hey, listen, when I ask you to make your bed and you don't make your bed, this is the story in my head. The story in my head is you don't care about about following through with my requests, and I take that as a sign of disrespect. So anyway, I think making sure that, and this is something we need to highlight and stamp in this conversation, is as it pertains to feedback, focusing on the behaviors and the impact as opposed to blame.
Correct.
Yeah.
Correct. So again, if you're predisposed, either person in the conversation, for defensive behavior, that's got to get cleared out of the way before anything can be heard.
Hmm.
And I would say in the example you gave about when it's time for an employee to move on, I would say my most difficult experiences are with employees who automatically, before you even gotten the whole sentence out, has a reason why it was broken.
Mm,
This glaring defense mechanism of, which basically for me says I'm not accountable no matter what happens.
mm,
So if so then you have to, pivot and change and have a little different conversation.
yeah.
But again, going back to understanding the motivation of the folks you're working with, and how well they think they fit in the role they have, and do they have any future aspirations,
Mm,
helps you really color these conversations as as guided a guided journey for them. And like I said, as an auditor at heart, I mean, I've been doing quality my whole life. Auditing is exactly that: gap analysis, identifying the gap. Fixing it's a different conversation. Identifying it is the focus of the audit.
mm,
I've been in some very tough conversations where, the folks didn't want to give me what I asked for. And I'll give you a great example. I was at a aseptic manufacturing facility in Europe by myself to do an audit. Highly technical people. They had zero confidence I knew anything of what I was speaking of.
mm,
And so at one point, I asked to see the airflow patterns that were in a particular production room because they were important to the conversation. And they said, well, blah, blah, blah. And I said, look, you could either bring me the blueprints Or I've got my flat shoes on and I wore pants today. We can go on the roof and you can walk me through the air handler process. Where's the intake? Where's the output? Because I need to understand what's happening physically in this part of your facility. And again, English was not their native language. They looked at each other, they had a conversation, they left me alone in the room for a couple of minutes. I thought to myself, I don't know what's going to happen. They came back with the blueprints as opposed to we're going to, risk having an auditor walk on our roof, right? And then I got to the point and I said, okay, explain this piece to me right here. And then they had their aha moment. I didn't even have to ask the question. Like just by setting the stage, they had their aha moment. And then at the closing of that audit, they said, we've had this plant in place for 6 or 7 years. No one has brought that to our attention. We didn't even realize it. And we
Mm,
want to thank you because they needed to fix it. And it was a pretty easy fix. But again, they were predispositioned that I had zero technical capability to give any input whatsoever, and instead, identified an issue that's been lagging for many years that they should have noticed and fixed. So
mm,
again, having confidence when you're in these conversations to continue to be an advocate for talking about the gap and not letting resistance prevent you from having that conversation.
yeah,
And again, sometimes you got to have it in pieces, right? Can't have it all at one time, but
yeah. Now, so you're given a lot of good anecdotes, pieces of information that people can use today. Um, is there a process that you follow, or is there a system that you follow when you're giving feedback?
I do. So when it's in the professional workplace, I actually will generally take all of the job descriptions that are in the role, in what I'm responsible for, and then I map them into what I think are the expectations of that role. Basically, what does smart, that algorithm, look like for that action? And then I put them in a grid and then I show them to the team. And I say, okay, well, if you are an auditor and you want to become a senior auditor and you want to become a manager or you want to become a vice president, here are the things, the row headers are all the tasks and the column headers are the roles. And then we're going to look at what that task
Mm,
looks like as you mature your career path.
mm,
So for me as a vice president, I'm probably not going to do an audit unless it's an issue of fraud
mm,
because there's so many other people more capable and next to the technology than I
mm,
am, right? Because as you continue your career path, you get further away from the tactical details and much more into the strategy. And that showing that to staff has probably been the biggest aha moment they've ever had because then they have a logical way to look at what do the skills mean and when can you leave them behind. So to your point, it's not just people moving out of the business, but it's people moving out of the comfort of where they've been in their career
mm,
path with confidence, not apprehension.
mm,
Because again, to be, I mean, I've been a VP for, I don't know, 25 years, whatever, right? And I never take it for granted that I had people coach me along the way in my career path that had significant impact into me choosing to do more because I
mm,
felt I was capable to do more. But there were also times in my career path, like you said, when I had my children early, I didn't want to travel, so I wanted to do certain things for a period of time. And it gave me confidence that you can move like the water, you can move through those different parts of your career. But the thing that's most common about your career is you, because it's your career. It's not everybody else's career.
mhm.
So knowing, and again, if the lighthouse is the guiding, my visualization of my career path is always the compass north, compass rose. If I know where my north is and I'm always pointed north, then the rest could be noise.
So really like what you had to say about the job description and then mapping it all out. So I'm trying and play devil's advocate.
Hmm.
Um, I could probably predict what you're going to say to this, but one person might say, it's too much work. I don't have the time. So that's one thing to address. The second thing to address is um, you've said, well, here's the matrix if we want to go from director to senior director to VP. What happens when they've checked all the boxes to get to VP? Liz, you told me if I did all this, I could become a VP, and now I can't become a VP. So
So that's
unpack that.
so I'm very cognizant about that as the first response.
Mm,
So I'm exceptionally even more cognizant of the language I choose. And
mm.
it's always you have the opportunity
Oh, okay.
to go to that role because
Given that it's open.
and that it's open. And you have to be open to the fact that it might not be open here. So if your
Mm,
dedication is skills to be able to be considered for a VP role, we can work on that.
mm.
Your goal is to get the title of VP. I can't guarantee anything about helping you
Oh, okay, great. So that's that. So in the grid, this is what's gonna unlock the door,
unlock the door. This
right?
is
So the
what you
door still might be closed,
correct.
but now it's unlocked. And so if the door now the door might open for you.
Because you can control that.
Mm,
And I think when people are giving feedback, they're trying to help people understand what they can and can't control.
mm,
But
yeah.
if in the feedback conversation, you're constantly getting deflection and you're constantly getting, well, you promised me this and you promised me that, you're not having a performance conversation,
Mm,
right? You're
right.
having a defensive conversation. So being very aware of what the conversation is about and what the
Yeah.
purpose of the conversation is.
Yeah, I really like that. So within the grid, this is what unlocks it, doesn't open it.
No,
Yeah,
no.
I like that. Um, so we've talked about feedback, defining the gap and the delta between expectations and performance, both negative, positive, or there
Mm,
isn't, right?
yeah. Oh, yeah.
And we know from auditing that there's people that identify the issues and then there's people that fix the issues. In
Yep.
this feedback conversation, how do you address the aspect of, okay, so we've uncovered the delta.
Right.
Now, how do we close that delta? How do you engage in that conversation?
Great question. So I usually have three sets of recommendations. One would be self-learning because I believe people that move seamlessly towards the opportunities to be asked to take on more actively manage that space. They're lifelong learners. And now, I mean, there's never been so much access to learning opportunities that are relatively inexpensive or almost free,
Yeah, right.
right? I mean, back in the day, if you didn't have a person to talk to, you were kind of out of. And remember, folks, I went to the library when you still had library little cards, 3x5, and you actually checked out a book. Nothing was electronic. So
Do you remember what that was called?
the bibliothèque, the little card file. I just
Yeah.
remember card file. Yeah.
Well, or the system of
Oh, not Dewey Decimal? Not Dewey.
the the
Dewey
Dewey
Decimal.
Decimal System.
Very different. That is the Encyclopedia Britannica. That's where you
Yeah,
spent your Saturday
that was
afternoons.
the internet.
Yeah, but yeah, no, but it's so different now, right? It's so different. So you have control over that. You can own that. You can craft that. Second
Mm,
thing is coaching. And my definition of coaching is skill set upskilling or reskilling. And it's very specific. It is a subject matter expert training, influencing, directing the actions of a person. Okay.
yep.
So auditors, you can train to do all kinds of audits. It's the same format, but it has different nuances, consequences, and the audiences are different. Okay. But then there's mentorship. And mentorship is really for me about helping the person on their self journey by asking them the hardest questions possible in the safest space available because you want them to make their plan, not for you to tell them, here was my plan, do it like me, But if someone comes to me and they've got their gap analysis and they say, I don't feel I have enough executive presence. I'm intimidated to talk to a vice president, but I want to be a vice president. To help me understand how I can bridge that gap. And then you
Mm.
can have all kinds of conversations. And I'll give you a great example of that. I belonged to the Healthcare Businesswomen's Association for many years, and it was on their mentoring program. And one year I had a mentee, and the exercise I had given that set of mentees was, if your life was a movie, what would it be? Draw me the picture of what that movie was. And this person came back with basically them as Indiana Jones.
Cool.
And they were a project manager. And I'm like, tell me more. Well, I've always, project management is project management, but I really would like to see the world, experience other cultures, and do other things. I said, so what's stopping you? She said, I don't really know. And so she went home, had a conversation with her husband. 3 months later, he had secured in his role a billet in Korea for 3 years, and they moved the family to Korea. And she said, if I hadn't done that exercise of really tuning into what I was passionate about, which was exploring the world still from my frame, and
Mm.
he hadn't had that opportunity, I couldn't make that happen. Now,
Mm.
that's not my path, but by asking those again open-ended questions, give me your rationalization. What gap are you trying to fill? You can help people on their own guided journey.
Yeah. Now here's something that we do, and it ties in perfectly with what we're talking about, right? So you just explained a situation where you help clarify life for somebody, and now they're gone, right? And so people listening are saying, well, yeah, yeah, that's nice, but now you've really made things a lot more difficult for me. Well, hold on a second. No, we haven't, and let me explain why. So at our company, and I'm sure many others do the same, we tell people if you want to leave, you're not at risk of being fired.
Yep,
And there is one role that is very, very unusual that as soon as there's that agreement that that person gets to stay on, and it's sales or business development. Generally speaking, it's an industry practice that if that person's not going to stay or they're going to leave, you can't keep them because they're going to get client information or they're not going to do their job, they're not going to build the relationship, all that kind of stuff. Well, if you're not willing to deal with that, then don't expect anybody to give you a heads up,
right.
right? And so when we're having these conversations and we're talking about the benefit of helping that individual and also the benefit of bringing somebody in and going from 90 to 95 or even more, what we can't gloss over is the fact that you're going to get a heads up. You're gonna know in advance this
Right.
is coming. You can plan for that so that the ceiling doesn't cave in. So that's I think that's one of the freeing parts of giving feedback is understanding that if that conversation goes to this might not be the right role, this might not be the right company, this might be a situation where I'm going to advance and that's going to leave a gap. The alternative of not engaging in that conversation is you get a 2 week notice.
Exactly.
And
And
now you're really in a hole.
because you have no heads up.
You
Now,
have
the other,
no heads up.
let's go back to my conversation where someone wanted this role that doesn't exist anymore. Well, if someone else had moved out, maybe those old roles could come back. So there's actually a positive domino effect, is
Mm.
because everyone sitting in a seat is preventing somebody else from getting in that seat.
Mm.
And so, from a succession planning perspective, there should be a natural tipping point where
Mm.
you're going to open it. And I would say for me as a VP, my job is always to put myself out of a job.
Yeah. And yeah. And so I think that's I'm just really excited about this part because people look at feedback, they're so nervous, oh, I'm gonna get them upset, they're gonna leave, something like that, right? It's okay. I mean, it's okay as long as you followed everything else Liz has told you to
Right.
do, right? but assuming that you've been prudent and responsible up until this point, when those conversations come up, you're doing yourself a service because the alternative is you get the 2 week notice and you didn't get the heads up and you couldn't plan accordingly.
Exactly. Exactly.
Um, I skipped over what I wanted to talk about, so I'm going to come back to this, which
Sure.
is the delta between giving feedback and remediating the issue.
Yeah.
Um, as a leader and manager, it is not our job to dictate how that's remediated.
Correct.
We are there as a resource and happy to be that, but that monkey is not on your back. So
Correct.
take that monkey off your back, say, look, it's my job to tell you the delta. It's your job to figure out how to do it, but I'm a partner. So I'm
Right.
willing to help you, uh,
Exactly.
so on and so forth, right?
Exactly. Exactly. Well, and it's all about taking responsibility
Yeah.
for for your outcomes. Yeah.
Yes. I want to, this time is flying, so I really, really am enjoying it. There's a couple last things I want to make sure we touch on, okay? I want to touch on um, short-term impacts of feedback. I want to touch on long-term impacts of feedback. And within this realm that we're talking about, what are some of the pitfalls
Hmm.
that you can say, hey, I've been doing this for 40 years. Don't do that. Be aware of this.
Right. So short term is that you level the conversation because usually if someone's not happy about it, about whatever it is, you got to open up the door and have that conversation. So short term, you know, cards are on the table. Long term is I always believe that everyone lands where they're supposed to be. And, as you manage your career, and, I've rotated between sponsor organizations, service organizations, and consulting. And I circled back to consulting at the beginning of this year after a long stint on the sponsor side, and that's natural for me in the cadence of my career path, and I get to help a lot of different people on different projects, and that's fun and cool. And the challenge is that you ultimately, to be passionate and to have a really high performing organization, everyone's got to be they're all in, and collectively their all ins are collaborative. And so if you don't if in doing this process it's creating more tension than resolution, you got to take a step back. You just have to take a step back. And sometimes you even have to be honest enough to say, hey, this is such a difficult conversation, I can't have it alone.
Mm,
So sometimes you might have to bring in another line manager.
okay.
If you bring in HR, everybody thinks you're going to get fired. So, put that to the side for the moment. But, you need to have a more honest conversation. And, a lot of this takes courage to have faithfulness that the goal is positive for everybody. So, my best advice is you need to understand the landscape that you're going to create in the conversation, and then you have to, if you're the one giving the feedback, you've got to really put some effort into understanding the best way to make that well heard by the person you're giving it to,
Mhm,
because it doesn't matter what you say if the person can't hear you.
mhm. Yeah. You always know what you say, but you never know what they hear.
And
And
we all know when the old telephone game you used to play
yeah,
in middle school or high school, or whatever,
yeah,
it's never the same, right?
uh,
It's never how you started. So
yeah. And I'm going to bring it back to this paradox of your, again, I'm just trying to revisit the human element of giving feedback. It's a little nerve-wracking.
it
Okay.
is.
Everybody's a little nerve-wracked and they want to do what's good for that person. They want to make sure that they don't disrupt their life and so on and so forth. Here's the paradox. The paradox is if you don't engage in difficult activity, you can't reap the benefit of succeeding after, right? And so, whether and extreme examples is writing a book, doing a marathon, things like this. The reason they're willing to go through all that and then do it again is because we as humans, if life is too easy, we can't experience that satisfaction of having been able to overcome it. And then on top of that, if we're so focused on making ourselves happy, it has a negative effect, right? And so really what you have to do is focus your time and energy on blessing others and supporting others without anything expecting anything in return. The
Yeah,
paradox is it comes back. So
absolutely.
so you receive that not which you search for, if that makes any sense.
It does.
So,
It does.
so engage in these feedback conversations. Understand it's going to be challenging. Make sure that the focus is on the company and the individual, and not don't expect anything in return. You'll see that those blessings do come back.
I completely agree.
Yeah. Well, Liz, we've got 2 minutes.
Wow.
We've got two
Excellent.
minutes left. So this has really been an enjoyable podcast. I know that, the goal of these podcasts is for people to get nuggets. They didn't get a nugget. They got a bag full of gold on this one. So what would you like to leave the audience with before we close?
Be courageous, everyone, because you're responsible for your own career. And if you ask for the feedback rather than wait for it, you might be able to land in the right cove at the right time with all the right support.
Hmm.
And
Awesome.
I've been blessed that way through my whole career. And I've really enjoyed today too. This has been an amazing opportunity, and I just really appreciate it.
Well, Liz, the pleasure is all mine. Thank you so much for joining and your insights, and for everybody listening. As always, if you find conversations like this valuable, please share it with a colleague or your professional network. If you haven't already, subscribe to get updates of new episodes at thefdagroup.com/podcast and follow the FDA group on LinkedIn. Also, get your copy of The Passionate Workforce: How to Create and Maintain Maximum Employee Engagement, #1 bestseller. Thank you, everyone, and we'll see you all next time.
Thank you.